true justice. Show mercy and compassion to one another. The Lord is righteous. He loves justice. Love tenderly those who are socially powerless. Uphold the cause of the oppressed. Maintain the right of the afflicted and destitute. Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. God's law is written on the heart of every human being. Treat people with protection and care.
Hi, everyone. You're listening to another episode of Cross-Examination with Mark Curran. I'm Mark Curran, your host on WSFI Catholic Radio 88.5 FM. Later, you'll be able to upload or download the podcast as well as see us on YouTube. Our guest today is the foremost expert on communist China, and that is Stephen Mosher. Stephen Mosher, and I have no biography in front of me, but I know him so well and so familiar. I'll just tell folks he was a professor. He's written a number of wonderful books. The most recent one, Stephen, is
the most recent one came out from Tan Books just a couple of months ago. It's called The Devil and Communist China.
So we'll get into that book a little bit. Stephen is a convert to the Catholic Church. He went to China as a university professor, a guest. He observed what was going on. It was an integral part in his becoming a Catholic, seeing China's one death policy with regards to children, and observing the atrocities of China. And Stephen is out there. He's put himself out there as probably one of the great enemies of communist China. He's not allowed to go anywhere near there right now. And certainly they have people watching him and everything else, but he continues to heroically tell the truth about China. And China is Donald Trump says, is a huge player in the world, obviously. And their importance and how they impact America cannot be understated. The debate between former President Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, the Democrat nominee and Vice President of the United States, Democrat nominee for president. And there were some references to China. She has chosen Tim Walz, who's the governor of Minnesota, as her running mate, the vice presidential candidate, the former congressman from Minnesota as well. They try to play him off as a big football coach. He was an assistant coach on a team in Minnesota that played football. He doesn't look like he was much of a football player ever, but that's, kind of what they're trying to sell you as far as Tim Walz. Very different man, very different in terms of when he was a teacher in the schools, what he did in terms of pushing DEI, as we referenced in an earlier show, diversity, equity, inclusion, and how that was a big part of his mindset. Also has been accused of, and is truthfully so, putting tampons in the boys' room and promoting LGBT to everybody, and almost it seemed like recruiting on some level the way he was doing it. Stephen Mosher wrote an article recently. Tim Walz defended communism in China to his students. Everyone is the same and everyone shares. Stephen, would you take it from there, buddy? Tell us what your thoughts are on this fellow, Tim Walz.
Tim Walz and I have something in common. We both went to China and spent a lot of time there. We both speak Chinese. I don't know how good Tim Walz's Chinese is. I can read, write, and speak Chinese fluently. And what happens when a foreigner arrives in China is this. The Chinese Communist Party, especially if it's a potential person of influence, that the Chinese Communist Party wants to co-opt and use and convert into an advocate for the Chinese Communist Party and the regime that runs China, they will do this. They will surround you with party officials who will tell you fabrications, lies, to put it bluntly, about the wondrous accomplishments of the Chinese Communist Party and what they have done for the Chinese people. Now, I faced the same banquets and the same panoply of Chinese officials that Tim Walz did. When I got to China, they invited me to banquet after banquet. They were giving me gifts as they were giving Tim Walz gifts. They were trying to toast me into, in sobriety. They're trying to get you drunk because they believe, like the ancient Romans, in vino veritas.
What's their drink of choice over there?
It is Mautai, which is a distilled rice liquor, and it's about 100 proof. And what they do is there's only one you, and there's 10 Chinese officials, and they toast you in turn, and they're only drinking one glass of Mautai, and if you're not clever, you wind up drinking 10, and then of course they find out what you really think. Well, the Chinese phrase for bottoms up is ganbei. And I think that Tim Walz ganbeied way too many times because he fell hook, line, and sinker for the Chinese propaganda. The proper response to ganbei, bottoms up, is to say sui yi, which means I'll just take a sip. So I listened to the lies of the Chinese Communist Party officials and then went out and spent a year talking to ordinary Chinese people about their life under communism. And I found out all about the tissue of lies, the fantasy that is communism, the evil that underlies it. What happened to Tim Walz was this. He went to an educational institution in China for a year. He was put under the surveillance and control of the local party committee. That's how these things work, you see. And they plied him with gifts and plied him with liquor and made him feel really good made him feel really important. And he came back saying things like, communism is wonderful. There's free food and free housing. No, there isn't. In the countryside, where most of the people of China live, there's no free food. You have to earn your bread by the sweat of your brow. There's no free housing. You have to build your homes if you want to have a house to live in. The only time there was supposedly free food in the Chinese countryside was in 1958, when Chairman Mao Zedong, one of the most evil men in human history, forced hundreds of millions of Chinese villagers to give up their own farms, to give up their own land, and force them into huge people's communes. 10,000 people, 50,000 people, 100,000 people were forced to farm the land together under the supervision of Communist Party officials. And they were told, you can now eat your fill in the commune kitchens. You won't have to worry about running out of food ever again. The party will feed you. Well, the party lasted about a year, and then the food ran out in the commune kitchens, and the villagers were sent home to starve. And you know how many people starved, Mark? 45 million people died in China from 1959 to the beginning of 1962, the worst famine in human history. And so much for free food, Tim Walz. They didn't get free food. The party officials that wined and dined him and that ganbeied him into drunkenness obviously were eating well. They feasted at banquets. Who paid for the banquets? The ordinary Chinese people. Who pays the party official salaries? Ordinary Chinese people. Who pays for their housing? Ordinary Chinese people who have to fend for themselves. There's no free housing either in the countryside. In fact, what's happening in China is the opposite. They're tearing down the homes of villagers. Party officials are building apartment buildings and then saying to the now homeless villagers, here's your new apartment, but you have to pay me rent for it.
Stephen, let me ask you just a little bit about that whole timetable. It looks like in reading your article that they brought Tim Walz over there shortly after the Tiananmen Square incident. They were trying to improve their image after what had happened in Tiananmen Square. And you indicated that he was there for a year. He spent was that right? He spent a year there, or a year in communist China. Wow. Crazy. Under what guise did they choose him, and how did they know that he was going to be the guy that we could really work our message and our lies through?
After the Tiananmen massacre, a lot of people had, before the Tiananmen massacre on June 4th of 1989, a lot of people had hoped that if we simply aided China, if we invested in China, if we exposed China to Western ideas of democracy, that a middle class would grow up and maybe the Communist Party would take a step back and we would see a peaceful evolution in the direction of respect for human rights and democracy. That dream died on Tiananmen Square when 10,000 people were murdered in the streets of the capital city on June.
And why were they murdered again? If just you can remind our listeners.
They were demonstrating for democracy. There were 1 million people in the streets of Beijing in May and June of 1989, asking for an end to one-party dictatorship, holding up signs with quotes from Lincoln and Jefferson and Patrick Henry saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." They were met with not liberty, they were met with death. The then leader, Deng Xiaoping, ordered the military in, and these unarmed students and workers were shot down in the streets, and some of them were run over with tanks and crushed into hamburger. It was a brutal massacre in the capital city. And people like myself, who had been hopeful in the earlier 80s that maybe the opening to China would produce positive results, realized that that wasn't going to happen, realized that this brutal one-party dictatorship was going to stay in power regardless of the human cost. And it was at that exact moment when people were recoiling from China in horror that Tim Walz decides to go to China. And of course, they were welcoming of him because so many people were distancing themselves from the bloody regime and the bloody massacre. And there he was going to China, working at teaching at a university. And again, the gifts and the banquets. His apartment at the university had air conditioning. Nobody else in the university had air conditioning except the senior party leaders, but he was given air conditioning. You see, they treated him very well. They told him lies about free food and free housing. And he became a defender of the regime. And they quickly realized that he would be very useful in propagandizing China among innocent, naive high school students in Nebraska and in Minnesota, where he later lived. After he left China, he set up an organization with funding from the Chinese Communist Party. And look, he says he has a friend in the foreign ministry, the government of China. The government of China is the Communist Party. Okay, let's make that clear. There is no separation between the party and the government. His trips to China, and he took 30 trips to China, bringing dozens of students each time to be propagandized by the Chinese Communist Party about the wonders of communism, was paid for in large part by the Chinese Communist Party. They provided free lodging and free food and transportation within China, so that these students could be taken around, these young, naive American students could be taken around and told about the wonders of socialism and communism. I mean, look, even after he has a long-standing and very cozy relationship with China, even after being a member of Congress, even after being elected to Congress, he continued to be a fellow, a visiting fellow at the Macau Polytechnic University, which is a Chinese institution that says it's devoted to and loves the motherland. So, that China connection continued after he was in Congress. But what I can't forgive him for really is the hundreds of young American students that he took to China and tried to tell them things like China's one-child policy was necessary because China has a large population. And if you violate the one-child policy, the only thing that happens to you is that you have to pay a fine. Well, no, Tim. I was in China. Those women who violated the one-child policy were arrested for the crime of violating it, for the crime of being pregnant without the permission of the Communist Party. They were taken and locked up. They were forcibly aborted and forcibly sterilized. Some of them were 7, 8, and 9 months pregnant. Some of them had their babies killed at birth. Why? Because the babies were illegal. And the Communist Party had declared that illegal children were the enemies of the state and must be eradicated. That's how the one-child policy was carried out in China. It wasn't just paying a fine. So he carried a lot of water, for China over the years.
You're listening to Stephen Mosher, the great expert on China, the wonderful author. He's been a guest on our show a number of times. Linda Pressey, our producer, on line as well with us, and Angela Tomlinson, CEO of WSFI Catholic Radio, is sitting next to me, WSFI 88.5 FM. When I hear this, I think Walz he doesn't seem like he's that stupid. Is he somebody that like the Chinese bosses figured, hey, it's good for me. I don't really care whether it's good for anybody else. So he sees the advantage of being close to China and the advantage of his being an insider and his cozying up, and whether or not that's good for America is kind of irrelevant. So let's push what they have to sell.
Yeah, no, and look, after coming back to the United States, after being recognized by the Chinese Communist Party as a friend of China, and after, of course, money began changing hands in the sense of funding these propaganda tours to the United States, he maintained a very close relationship to China, not only as the visiting fellow of a Chinese educational institution, but he also spoke alongside the president of a Chinese association that the State Department itself exposed as a Chinese Communist Party effort to influence and co-opt local leaders. You have to understand that China has a huge influence operation in the United States. It is huge. It runs the China Daily. It has newspaper stands throughout our major cities where you can pick up these propaganda broadsheets everywhere in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Washington, D.C. We don't have any newspapers in China, by the way, because they won't allow us to do that. They have Confucius Institutes at our universities. We don't have any George Washington Institutes in China. And they have lots of funding of organizations that they set up as Chinese American friendship organizations. They have them in major cities throughout the United States. They have them in Minneapolis. All of these organizations are set up by, and in my view, funded by, in whole or in part, by the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Department. So they are extensions of the party in the United States. Tim Walz has a long and deep connection with the local group in Minneapolis.
We took. Sorry, I'm sorry, Stephen. Go ahead.
So the ties go the ties go back decades, and the ties continue to the present day. And he's a member of the Executive Commission on China, which is supposed to be set up to look at China and look at the threat that China poses to the world, to the United States, to its own people. And on that committee, he argues that we shouldn't view China as an adversary. He says we shouldn't view China as an adversary. Well, China, run by the Chinese Communist Party, in May of 2019, declared a people's war, direct quote, people's war on the United States. So if China regards us as an enemy, then it probably is an adversary of the United States. Wouldn't you say, Mark?
I would agree, Stephen. And when I hear you, and you're such a good man, and I'm so glad that you've been guided by the Catholic teachings as well, as you were a convert and came into the faith, and that helped form you. But when I listen to you, I get a little bit depressed. I get a little bit scared. And then I think to myself, there's Stephen Mosher. He's talking about these things. And I want you to tell us, one, what's China's endgame? We've talked about this before. And two, why isn't anybody, the Tim Walz and the people that are cozy with China, and yet you don't really hear any opposition to it? What is it that has the Senate and the House in Washington, D.C., and even local general assemblies afraid to talk about China, afraid to talk about their growing influence? What do they think is going to happen to them if they do go there?
We do have people in Congress who are concerned about this. First of all, we should say that Representative Comer, in the committee, who runs the Committee on Oversight and Accountability in the House of Representatives, has launched an investigation into Tim Walz's extensive ties with China and with Chinese Communist Party run groups in the United States. So there is an ongoing investigation. There is a lot of concern about, I call him Tiananmen Tim, about his connections to China. And it's very odd. It's a very weird individual, too, because he chose to be married on the anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre, which, if you think about it, I mean, that's not a happy day. That's not a day that we should commemorate in any way. It's not a day we should have a celebration like a marriage on. It's a day on which we should mourn the loss of the thousands of people killed by the communist regime.
For him, you don't think it was accidental or coincidental?
I find it bizarre. I find it inexplicable. Knowing what June 4th, 1989 means to the Chinese people and knowing how many died at the hands of the communist regime, why anyone in their right mind would pick that day for a marriage celebration is beyond me.
When I said that earlier, how I get concerned and afraid listening to you, I'm so glad I do. I mean, I think the worst thing that we can do is be ignorant and just bury our heads in the sand and let this continue to happen. So I want you to talk a little bit about what a Harris-Walz presidency looks like for America and what position that puts us in as far as dealing with China.
I think a Harris-Walz presidency would be a disaster for the United States on many fronts. In fact, I can't think of any benefits that would accrue from having this particular pair of individuals in the White House for ordinary Americans. China is a particular concern because China is our, unlike, I disagree, of course, with Tim Walz, China is our chief adversary around the world. China runs a huge and growing influence operation in the United States. China has co-opted and in many cases compromised officials in the federal government, in the state government, and in the local government throughout the United States. We're talking about literally a $10 billion operation in the United States. Now, we heard recently about Russia spending $10 million to buy a little influence on social media. That's chump change. I mean, China is spending billions of dollars to buy and influence and subvert American democracy because it regards American democracy as a principal threat to its dominance of the planet and to its continued rule over China. You know, the interesting thing for me as a China watcher is when Xi Jinping took power in late 2012, 12 years ago, Xi Jinping being the current dictator of China, the current leader of the Chinese Communist Party, he immediately published a secret directive to the members of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, and it identified 7 mortal threats to the continued rule of the Chinese Communist Party. And among those mortal threats to the continued rule were things like the rule of law, property rights, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, all of the things we associate with a fully functioning open society, open democracy. They regarded as a threat to their continued rule because they believe in the opposite. They believe in total control. And the two remaining mortal perils were, get this, an accurate account of the history of the Chinese Communist Party and an accurate account of the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party. Why would the history and ideology of the Chinese Communist Party be a mortal threat to the party's continued rule? Well, because the ideology is a fantasy, right? One day the government's going to fade away, the party's going to fade away, everyone will be equal, will be happy forever. And the history is a fantasy because they gloss over the 45 million people who died during the famine after the Great Leap Forward. They gloss over the 65 million people who died in various purges and persecutions and the Cultural Revolution. They gloss over the 400 million unborn children who died during the one-child policy, which ran from 1980 when I was first in China and only ended in 2016. The total death toll from the Chinese Communist Party is 500 million people. The Chinese Communist Party is the biggest killing machine in human history. They don't want to remind the Chinese people of their history. They don't want to tell the Chinese people that the communism, this myth of equality down the road sometime in the distant future is a fantasy. Communism is a great mechanism for controlling and exploiting masses of people. That's all it is. That's all it has ever been. And so people who are drawn to China and people who are drawn to socialism are drawn to this political structure, which enables them to extract resources and obedience from large numbers of people. That's the attraction of communism and socialism to people on the left. It is an attraction fed by greed and fed by lust for power, and so it
and envy, right? Envy is
and envy, playing on the natural human inclination to be jealous of our fellows.
right.
They use that envy to seize power and
Rich
money.
people are the scapegoat for that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so Tim Walz and Kamala Harris would not want to criticize China. They would continue to regard China as a power that we can work with, that we can collaborate with on some issues like, I don't know, they like to talk a lot about climate change, and they pretend that China is collaborating with them on climate change when China is building a coal-fired power plant every 2 weeks. A new
Don't you wish all our listeners could go to see China and breathe the air and
oh my. China is the most polluted country on earth. The water in most cities and most towns in the country is undrinkable. The air in big cities is unbreathable, and the land, the soil itself is polluted, often cases by heavy metals. The Communist Party has been raping China, and figuratively speaking, raping its resources, exploiting its resources, including people. They simply regard people as another resource to be exploited and used. And if the number of people is too large, well, you force everyone to abide by a one-child policy. And now that the number of people is getting too small and the population of China is actually declining, you are going to see forced pregnancy in China before this government is done.
Yeah, we're going to incentivize it now. So, Stephen, you're listening once again to WSFI Catholic Radio 88.5 FM. I know Linda has a point, and I'm going to go to her. But I just one thing that I'm curious about, and we've talked about this in the past, the end game. Do they want Americans all to be communists like them, or do they just want us to suffer and go away? They don't have the nukes that Russia, Pakistan, and Israel and we have. I mean, so they're not going to blow us up, are they? But they do want us as we exist now to go away.
We know from our own intelligence reports that China is building up its nuclear arsenal as rapidly as it can, and for a long time it had a limited nuclear arsenal of just a few hundred warheads. That's now estimated at a couple thousand. So the idea that they couldn't wreak havoc on the homeland, I think, is a little dated now. They could, and they've actually talked about the People's Liberation Army Daily, which is the newspaper published by the army in China. The People's Liberation Army actually several years ago published a map of the United States showing the cities that could be hit with Chinese intercontinental ballistic missiles and estimating the number of casualties that would result. Can you imagine a newspaper in the United States publishing a map of China with the cities identified that would be targeted by nuclear? I mean, it sounds insane to talk about, but this was actually published in China by the Army's newspaper, I guess, to encourage the members of the People's Liberation Army to think that one day they might actually succeed in destroying or conquering the United States. As far as their ambitions, right now, their ambitions are limited not just to their neighborhood, but to the Americas. They're the principal supporter of Maduro in Venezuela. Why did Maduro not step down after clearly losing the election? Because China, on the very day that the votes were still being counted and it was clear that he was going down to defeat, issued a statement saying that we support Venezuelans leader, newly elected President Maduro. They've been providing him with arms. They've been providing him with funding. They support Cuba, which is just 90 miles off the coast of southern Florida. If you name a regime around the world, like Iran, a regime that is a terroristic regime, you will find that its principal supporter is China. So China is not just making problems in its immediate neighborhood. It is acting now on the world stage. Russia would not be able to continue its attack on Ukraine without the ongoing support from China in terms of supplies for the Russian army, in terms of replacement parts for Russian military vehicles, and so on. And of course, the diplomatic support. Hamas would not have been able to attack Israel if China had not supplied it through its contacts with Hamas, with Huawei electronic equipment, phones, and computers that were encrypted that the Israelis could not penetrate and get intelligence about the impending attack. So wherever you look in the world, wherever you see a despotic regime on the march, oppressing its own people and looking perhaps beyond its borders to be aggressive towards its neighbors, you find behind that is China making mischief, trying to do what? Trying to disperse our forces and deplete our munitions. And that's exactly what's happened now because of the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. Our forces are being dispersed, our munitions are being depleted, and for the first time in many, many years, we have no carrier in the Western Pacific.
So law enforcement experts are arguing that we are already in a war with China, and they have already killed millions of our own people, mainly because we know for a fact that the Sinaloa cartel bring in the fentanyl is literally working for China. So can you tell our audience exactly how policy in the last 4 years, where we have seen roughly about a plane size amount of people dying every day because of the Chinese Sinaloa cartel collusion to poison American citizens, how current policy would even change or even worsen under a Harris-Walz regime?
Well, under a Harris-Walz administration, the border would remain open. The cartels would be free to bring fentanyl into the country and kill 80, 90,000, 100,000 Americans every year. Now, but you're perfectly correct. This whole scheme is set up by the Chinese Communist Party, in my view, to wage a kind of chemical warfare on the United States. We saw with COVID, of course, a few years ago, the waging of biological warfare on the United States, the deliberate spreading of COVID to our shores. We are now seeing, and have been seeing for some years, a chemical warfare on the United States, where all of the precursors to fentanyl, norfentanyl, for example, are made in China and then shipped to labs, some in British Columbia, most in the cartels in northern Mexico, where they are then subjected to a final simple chemical process to be turned into deadly fentanyl and then brought across the border and spread throughout the United States with the resulting deaths of American citizens. And by the way, the money that is generated from the fentanyl trade is laundered by Chinese banks. So the Sinaloa cartel, the other cartels, are making billions of dollars from the sale of these deadly drugs. The money is laundered by China so they can then get it back and turn it into investments so the whole thing is set up and run by China. I believe that the Chinese Communist Party knows exactly where the fentanyl precursors are being produced. And I believe from reports that I've seen that China is actually subsidizing the export of the fentanyl precursors overseas to British Columbia and to northern Mexico. And so, yes, this is a form of chemical warfare, and it's been cost-free to China so far. All we've done so far over the last 3.5 years under Harris and Biden is to go to China and say, oh, please help us control this deadly epidemic in the United States and the Chinese of drug overdoses and deaths. And the Chinese Communist Party officials will smile and say, of course, we'll help you. And then, of course, they do nothing and go back into the secret meetings and say, it's working. Americans are dying. We're paying no cost at all in terms of our relationship with the United States. Why shouldn't we continue this chemical warfare against the United States?
You talked about how the CCP has aligned itself with Maduro and some of these other dictators.
Yes.
There was a 4 years ago, or in 2020, right after the election here, John Ratcliffe, the former spy chief for the country, came out with a report saying that the CCP did in fact try to meddle in our elections. And now a report that came out in May is resurrecting that same notion that the CCP will be meddling in our elections. So what do you say to the listeners who might be very concerned about, a Harris-Walz situation where they get into office and it's okay, there's nothing we could do to stop the CCP meddling, and we don't know the depths of the meddling of our elections?
No, they wouldn't do anything about the meddling because obviously Harris and Walz, being longtime friends of China, would be their preferred candidates. They would like to see them in the White House. And so the influence operations, the subverting of American democracy, the use of our freedoms of speech and assembly and association to actually create groups and publications and social media outlet like TikTok to corrupt and confuse the youth into thinking that socialism or communism is actually a wonderful way to solve all of our problems and get your student loans paid off. All of those things would continue under Harris and Walz. There would be some occasions when they might rhetorically criticize China for this or that. There might be some photo ops of meetings between Harris and Xi Jinping, at which Xi Jinping pledges to stop expanding and building military bases in the South China Sea, which, of course, Xi Jinping pledged to Obama in 2016 in the Rose Garden, and of course, didn't do any of that. But you would not get real change. You would not have the United States defended against the ongoing chemical warfare, against the ongoing theft of intellectual property, $600 billion a year in theft of intellectual property, the ongoing ransacking of American companies for all of their technological information by computer hacking, using battalions of People's Liberation Army soldiers to carry out these hacking operations. All of that would continue, which would mean the gradual decline of the United States and the gradual ascent of China. China's idea of the world is that it should be at the middle of the world. It should be the middle kingdom, the kingdom at the center of the earth, to which all other countries pay tribute and acknowledge its leadership. And I think that is the goal of the Chinese Communist Party. Conquest in the sense of conquering Taiwan and controlling the South China Sea. But beyond that, it is a matter of influence and control. And they've been on the march for a long time. We have to understand the Chinese Communist Party from its very beginning was set up in opposition to the Nationalist Party of China, set up by Sun Yat-sen. And the Nationalist Constitution is actually modeled on the US Constitution. It guarantees freedom of speech, assembly, association. It is the Western democratic, the American democratic model. Sun Yat-sen was a great admirer of American democracy. The Chinese Communist Party was set up in opposition to that. And once it defeated the nationalists, it turned to the source of and the strength of Western democracy, which is the United States, and it wants to defeat it too. And it's using the same means to defeat us that it used to win the Civil War against the nationalists. During the Civil War, the Chinese Communist Party set up newspapers in nationalist areas. It set up front groups. It set up a socialist party. It set up other political parties, all front groups for the Chinese Communist Party in order to weaken, to use the freedoms of an open society to weaken that open society and make it vulnerable to conquest and defeat.
What drives all this, and what allows us to flourish, if you will. So in the past, I've talked to you about this, and I never would have thought China was a threat that it is if I didn't know you and I didn't start paying attention to you and your books and everything else. And the reason being, communism. What is in it for the worker, the low guy? He has a garbage life. And so radical Islam, I always thought was a far greater threat. Because if you go in and you kill those infidels, according to some readers of the Quran, and not everybody subscribes to that reading of the text, but enough do. If you go in and you kill those infidels, you are going straight to heaven, and life on earth is garbage anyways. And you just keep pumping that message, and then you got young Islamic boys, sign me up, I want to go to heaven. How does communism continuing? And I think back to with Poland and the former Soviet Union and in the fall under Reagan, and I think that's got to be China's future, because I don't know how they're able to continue to have all these willing, people that are emissaries of their message when they get nothing out of it.
Well, actually, they do get something out of it, and that is that the Chinese Communist Party, in its overseas propaganda and United Front departments, uses three different techniques to get control over politicians or government officials. They use money, they use drugs, and they use honeypots. Just ask Congressman Eric Swalwell. That's how they operate. Now, they also have an additional means of leverage over Chinese Americans. Imagine a young Chinese American who comes over, a young Chinese who comes over, goes to the university here, stays here, becomes an American citizen, and actually is drawn to the open and free. He gets used to breathing the free air. He likes being here. He likes living under American democracy. And the Chinese Communist Party approaches him through an agent and says, we'd like your help. He says, no. And they say, you have relatives back in China. Your father and mother still live in China. You want them to join you in the United States. That will not be possible unless you cooperate with us. You have other relatives who will suffer in China if you don't do our bidding. You see, the Chinese Communist Party regards all Chinese, regardless of their citizenship, as being people that should be under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And so it doesn't hesitate to use these kinds of threats. I spent years after the Tiananmen massacre organizing and working with the Chinese democracy movement. In the early 90s, I was at the Claremont Institute. We held conferences, we held retreats, we encouraged the pro-democracy movement. And over the years, more recently, I have seen many leaders of the pro-life democracy movement picked off one by one by the Chinese communist regime. And how do they do it? Well, one friend of mine in 2018 learned that his father was ill back in China, and the Chinese Communist Party said, we won't give you a visa to travel to China to see your dying father unless you agree to give us information and collaborate with us. And he felt like he was being unfilial in not being there for his father's passage. And so he agreed to do that. That story can be repeated over and over and over again. These people, the Chinese Communist Party operates like a mafia and does not hesitate to strong arm people into doing its bidding.
What's really troubling for me is, as a Catholic, and you're a Catholic, Linda, Angela, this is a Catholic radio network, is that if you go back in time, and Fulton J. Sheen had his hour, and communism was, he just kept pounding it, and how at odds it is with Catholic teaching and everything else. And he wasn't alone. Priests, bishops, cardinals throughout the United States just beat the hell out of communists with a drum that it was horrible and everything else. We have nobody in the Catholic Church, really, virtually, that's saying anything negative about communism right now, or even talking about it.
Yeah. And the great Archbishop Fulton Sheen, I quote repeatedly in my book, The Devil and Communist China. And Archbishop Fulton Sheen was absolutely clear that atheistic communism was absolutely incompatible with Catholicism, and that one or the other must prevail over time. And he pointed out that at the basis of communism is a hatred of God, is a rejection of God. And you saw that in Chairman Mao Zedong, who said as a young man that he was godless and lawless. And of course, that makes sense, because if you reject God, of course, you reject the law that's written in every human heart. And he did not hesitate to murder, to lie, to cheat, and steal to gain power. Again, one of the most evil men in human history. He and Archbishop Fulton Sheen only agreed on one thing. They agreed that communism was not love. Archbishop Fulton Sheen said, for the first time in human history, we have an ideology based not on love, but on hate, hatred of of different classes, hatred of different races, hatred of different ethnicities. And he said it's the very opposite of Christianity, which is based on love, love of God and love of neighbor. And oddly enough, and worrisomely enough, Mao Zedong agreed with him. Mao Zedong said at many points, he said, communism is not love. Communism is a hammer that we use to destroy the enemy. And so you have to think of communism as sort of an ideology of hate and division. And that, I think, goes a long way to explaining why the Chinese Communist Party is the biggest killing machine in human history. For a long time, it was led by Mao Zedong, who, for example, said in 1960, when tens of millions of his countrymen were starving to death, he said, let them eat grass and the bark of trees. He said, as tens of millions of his countrymen were dying, he said, it's good if half the population dies because the other half will have enough to eat. He said that it's good if people die because their bodies fertilize the soil. This was a man who was presiding over the biggest famine in human history, and he was celebrating the death. So at one level, communism ultimately is a kind of collective suicide cult. It is a death cult. It celebrates death. Communism always kills. Sometimes it kills slowly. Sometimes it kills quickly, but it always leads to death. And that's why I think it's ultimately diabolical. Obviously, God is the author of life. God is a God of love. The devil can't create anything. He can only destroy. And his greatest victory is to destroy human beings, the pinnacle of God's creation.
I had heard that China is the #1 producer of Bibles in the world. Should we be concerned? Should we be looking in our Bible to see where it was printed and where we got it from?
Well, I look at everything to see where it's made, and I don't buy things made in China. And I would advise everyone listening to try to boycott goods made in China. I know it's not easy, but I led in 1990, after the Tiananmen massacre, one of the first boycotts of Chinese goods in the United States. We called it the toycott because at that time, many toys were made in China. They now make higher end things, but we tried to get people to avoid buying toys made in China. And we've carried on that boycott ever since. There's no reason why we should be fueling the rise of the country that wants to destroy us by buying goods made in China. The dollars that come in help prop up the Chinese economy and help, of course, to build the Chinese military, which one day we might find ourselves actually in a clash with. So, yeah, that's my general rule, is not to buy anything made in China.
I've been so blessed to have Stephen Mosher on with us, the foremost expert on China in the world. This is WSFI Catholic Radio 88.5 FM. Mark Curran, the show's cross-examination. Our producer, Linda Precia, our CEO, is also here, Angela Tomlinson. Stephen, I want to talk about the devil in communist China from Mao to Xi. And I want to ask you one question, though. And I think that, first of all, this book is a must read, like anything that Stephen's written, if you can. And I haven't gotten to it, but I'm going to make an affirmation to this audience that I will get this book and that I will read it because it is so important. Stephen, does socialism always lead to communism? And where is the United States on that track as far as socialism and beginning to resemble China, and what needs to happen for that not to be us?
I think we're on that slippery slope right now, and it is a slippery slope from socialism to communism, because the only difference is that the communist will achieve by overt force what the socialist will try to achieve by backroom manipulations. But the one leads to the other because the committed socialist believes that the government is the solution to all of our problems. And believing that, they are tempted to go farther and farther in their government interventions in the economy, provoking a more and more of a backlash from the population. And ultimately, the committed socialists will realize that in order to move further down the road to solving all of, well, they think solving all of the country's problems, they must use force to attack and imprison and silence their opposition. And at that point, you move from socialism to communism. The progress down that road is almost inevitable, especially because these organizations, the people who rise to the top of these organizations, like the Chinese Communist Party, are not nice people. The people who survived the factional infighting in the Central Committee and the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party are those who are expert in backstabbing and deceit and deception and laying traps and all of the rest. So the Machiavellians who rise to the top of these organizations are almost inevitably moral monsters who are willing to do anything to seize and hold power. We do see peaceful pro-lifers being arrested and sentenced to long prison terms. We do see the FBI doing surveillance of Catholics because they hold traditional views. We do see some very worrisome signs that there are people in Washington today who don't appear to be governed by any respect for our traditional values and the limits placed on their activities by the Constitution. So I'm quite worried about where we are as a nation. I'm perhaps more worried now than I've ever been in my lifetime. And I'm particularly worried because I see parallels between the kinds of actions that the Chinese Communist Party is taking in China against potential and real dissidents, and the kind of actions that the current government is taking against its political critics. The weaponization of the justice system against President Trump, for example, is something that's never happened before in human history, in American history, and should really never happen again.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Linda, when we're done, I'd love it if you could put the link for Stephen's new book up there. They can purchase it at a number of different sites, and we strongly recommend it here. We've read a number of his other books and interviewed him on those books. Go ahead, Stephen. You were going to say something.
Can I say that thanks to the generosity of a donor who wants this book to get into the hands of young people who have not been told about the dangers of socialism and communism in school, who perhaps have been told by teachers like Tim Walz in years past that communism is wonderful because everyone gets free food and free housing. A generous donor has made it possible for us to offer the book free to the first 25 people who visit our website at pop.org.
Well, let's put that up there for sure. That's a beautiful thing. And if anybody else wants to donate to Stephen Mosher to see that as paying it forward, we'd love that as well. Stephen, we are not afraid, despite all of this overwhelming information and the fact that people want to see us destroyed and want us to suffer miserably, and those people being the Chinese Communist Party. We are not afraid because we have our armor in the Catholic teachings, the Catholic Church, the Catholic faith. And so just to protect us here today, to continue to protect WSFI Catholic Radio, to protect all the people involved in this show, and to protect Stephen Mosher, we'd be so honored if you would close us in prayer, St. Michael's prayer, whatever prayer you like, but just pray for our protection, if you would, with the listeners.
Well, I think the St. Michael's prayer is particularly appropriate, given that the devil in communist China is real. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our
protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil.
May God
rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, Prince of the heavenly host,
by
the power of God, cast into hell Satan
and all the evil
spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls.
Amen. Father, Son. Amen.
Thank you, Stephen. That was awesome, buddy. Thank you. Thank you. We really appreciate and love you.